They say a wedding day is the beginning of forever. The flowers are chosen, the vows rehearsed, the guests already seated in neat rows waiting for two lives to become one. But for one man standing in a church hallway on what should have been the happiest morning of his life, forever ended before it even began. Because the woman he was about to marry, the woman he'd trusted with his future, forgot to end a phone call. And what he overheard in those few stolen seconds wasn't just a conversation. It was a confession, a truth so raw, so unexpected, that it didn't just stop a wedding. It rewrote everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the person standing beside him at the altar. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't a fairy tale, it's a reckoning. And it starts with a simple mistake that changed two lives forever. Who was this man before that moment? What kind of love brings two people to the edge of marriage, only to unravel in a single breath? And when the truth finally surfaced, when the words hung in the air like smoke, was it betrayal or was it something deeper, something neither of them could name? What would you do if the person you were about to vow your life to revealed a secret you were never meant to hear? Would you walk away? Would you forgive? Or would you stand there, frozen, wondering if love was ever really what you thought it was? Keep watching, because this story doesn't go where you think. And the answers might just make you question everything you believe about trust. Michael Carter was 52 years old when he met Elaine, and by then, he'd learned that life rarely handed out second chances. He'd spent 30 years working as a logistics manager, the kind of job where you solve other people's problems quietly, and go home to an empty apartment that smells faintly of microwave dinners and old books. His first marriage had ended a decade earlier, not in fire but in slow erosion, two people who woke up one day and realized they'd become strangers. He didn't blame anyone, he just learned to live alone. But loneliness has a way of wearing you down, and by the time Michael turned 50, he'd started wondering if companionship was something he'd simply aged out of. Then came Elaine. She was 48, a widow who'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years prior. They met at a church fundraiser, one of those community events where everyone's too polite to admit they're just there for the free coffee and homemade pies. Michael had volunteered to help set up tables. Elaine was manning the coffee station when the ancient urn started leaking, sending a stream of dark liquid across the tablecloth. He rushed over with a stack of napkins. She laughed at the chaos, and somehow in the middle of that small disaster, they started talking. Really talking. About loss. About starting over. About how strange it felt to be their age and still hoping for something new. Their relationship grew the way second-chance romances often do, quietly, without the rush of youth but with a kind of intentional care. They had dinner dates where they actually listened to each other. They took walks in the park and talked about their grown children, their regrets, the things they wished they'd done differently. Elaine had a way of making Michael feel seen, not as someone damaged or past his prime, but as someone still capable of being loved. She was gentle, thoughtful, always asking how his day went, always remembering the small things he mentioned in passing. And Michael, for his part, wanted to give her stability. He wanted to be the man who didn't leave, who didn't let her down, who showed up every single day. After a year of dating, he proposed. Nothing flashy, just a quiet evening at her favorite restaurant, a modest ring, and a promise that they'd build something real together. Elaine cried when she said yes, and Michael felt, for the first time in years, like he'd done something right. The wedding was planned for 6 months later, a small ceremony at the church where they'd met, just close family and a handful of friends. Michael didn't need spectacle. He just needed her. The morning of the wedding arrived with that strange, electric feeling that hovers over big days. Michael woke up early in his hotel room, his suit already pressed and hanging on the closet door, his hands shaking slightly as he tied his tie. He wasn't nervous about marrying Elaine. He was nervous about everything going smoothly, about being the kind of husband she deserved, about not letting his own doubts creep in and sabotage something good. He arrived at the church an hour before the ceremony, greeting guests, shaking hands, accepting congratulations from people who barely knew him but seemed genuinely happy for this late-in-life love story. Elaine was in the bridal suite upstairs, surrounded by her sister and 2 bridesmaids, all of them laughing and fussing over last-minute details. Michael caught a glimpse of her through the doorway, beautiful in her simple ivory dress, and felt a swell of gratitude so overwhelming he had to look away. But then, about 30 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin, Michael realized he'd left his cufflinks in the car. Small thing, easy fix. He headed down the hallway toward the side exit, his footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors. That's when he heard her voice. Elaine was standing near a half-open window at the end of the corridor, her back to him, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, guarded, the kind of tone people use when they don't want to be overheard. Michael slowed his steps, not because he intended to eavesdrop, but because something in her voice stopped him cold. She sounded different, strained, almost calculating. He couldn't make out every word at first, just fragments carried by the acoustics of the hallway. Then she said something that made his chest tighten. He still doesn't know. After today, it won't matter. I'll finally be secure. Michael's breath caught. He stood frozen, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd just heard. Secure? Doesn't know what? He took a step closer, his pulse hammering in his ears. Elaine continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. I know it's not ideal, but I didn't have a choice. The debt's too much. I can't keep pretending everything's fine. Once we're married, his accounts become joint. I'll have access. I'll be able to fix this without him ever finding out. Michael felt the floor tilt beneath him. Joint accounts. Access. Fix this. The words looped in his mind, each one landing like a stone in his gut. She kept talking, something about creditors, about timing, about how she just needed a few months to sort everything out. And then, as if sensing something, she turned slightly and her eyes met his. The color drained from her face, the phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the windowsill. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, staring at the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 30 minutes, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the stranger standing in front of him. Elaine's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Michael, that wasn't. Her voice cracked. He held up a hand, stopping her. Don't. The word came out harder than he intended, but he couldn't help it. His mind was a storm of questions, each one louder than the last. How long had she been planning this? Was any of it real? The walks, the dinners, the nights she'd held his hand and talked about their future. Had all of that been a performance? He turned and walked back down the hallway, ignoring the way Elaine called after him, her voice breaking into something that sounded like desperation. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to think. Outside, the church lawn was dotted with guests milling around, laughing, taking photos. They had no idea that inside, everything was falling apart. Michael walked to the far end of the parking lot, leaned against his car, and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to storm back in there and call the whole thing off, to stand in front of everyone and expose her for what she'd done. But beneath the anger was something else, confusion, hurt, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of understanding he didn't want to admit. Because he remembered things now, small things he'd brushed aside. The way Elaine sometimes flinched when bills arrived in the mail. The way she'd casually mentioned once that her late husband had left her with more problems than she'd expected, but she'd laughed it off and changed the subject. The way she'd seemed relieved, almost too relieved, when Michael had suggested combining their finances after the wedding. He'd thought she was just being practical, but now, those moments took on a different weight. She'd been in trouble, real trouble, and she hadn't told him. Michael's hands curled into fists. Why hadn't she just asked for help? Why had she thought the only way to fix her problems was to trick him into a marriage where she could quietly siphon off his savings? Did she think he wouldn't have helped her if she'd just been honest? Or had she assumed he'd walk away the moment he knew the truth? He looked up at the church, at the stained glass windows glowing in the midday sun, and realized he didn't know which scenario hurt more. The thought that she'd used him, or the thought that she hadn't trusted him enough to tell the truth. Inside, he could hear the organ starting to play. The ceremony was supposed to begin in 10 minutes. Guests were filing into the sanctuary, taking their seats, waiting for a bride and groom who might never appear. Michael closed his eyes and made a decision. He walked back into the church, past the confused glances of ushers and the concerned whispers of guests who sensed something was off. He found Elaine in the small room off the vestibule where she'd been waiting, her face streaked with mascara, her hands shaking. Her sister stood nearby, looking between them with wide, uncertain eyes. Michael looked at Elaine and said, quietly, "We need to talk, alone." Her sister hesitated, then slipped out of the room, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elaine spoke first, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. Michael, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you." He crossed his arms, forcing himself to stay calm. "Tell me what, exactly? That you're in debt? That you were planning to use me to fix it? That everything we've built was just, what? A way to solve your financial problems?" "No." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, it wasn't like that. I mean, yes, I'm in debt. Serious debt. My husband, he made some terrible investments before he died. He borrowed money from people I didn't even know about, and when he passed, they came after me. I've been paying them off for 3 years, Michael. I sold almost everything. The house, the car, my jewelry. I'm barely keeping my head above water." Michael's jaw tightened. "So you thought marrying me was the solution?" "I thought." She wiped at her face, smearing the mascara further. "I thought if I could just get through this, if I could buy myself some time, I could figure it out without dragging you into it. I didn't want you to know because I didn't want you to think I was broken. I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now. And lying was better. I wasn't lying. I wasn't telling you everything." "That's the same thing, Elaine." She sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. I know it is, and I hate myself for it. But I was desperate. Michael, you don't know what it's like to wake up every day wondering if today's the day they come and take everything. To feel like you're drowning and there's no one to help you. I thought if I married you, I'd finally be safe. And yes, I thought having access to joint accounts would give me the breathing room I needed. But it wasn't just about the money. I do love you. I swear I do." Michael stared at her, trying to see past his own hurt, trying to understand. And maybe, against every instinct telling him to walk away, he did understand. A little, because he knew what desperation looked like. He'd seen it in his own mirror years ago, after his divorce, when he'd felt like his life was a series of failures he couldn't outrun. But understanding didn't erase the betrayal. "You should have told me," he said, his voice thick. "If you'd just been honest, if you'd come to me and said you were in trouble, I would have helped you. We could have figured it out together. But you didn't trust me enough to do that. You chose to lie instead." "I was scared," she whispered. "I was scared you'd leave. And now?" He gestured around the empty room, the unstarted ceremony, the wreckage of what should have been their beginning. "What do you think is going to happen now?" There was no wedding that day. Michael stood in front of the gathered guests and, in a voice that somehow stayed steady, explained that the ceremony wouldn't be taking place. He didn't go into details, he didn't shame Elaine or air her secrets. He just said that sometimes, life reveals things we need to see before we make lifelong commitments, and today had been one of those days. He thanked everyone for coming and asked them to respect their privacy. The guests left quietly, confused but polite, and soon the church was empty, except for Michael, Elaine, and the pastor, who offered to mediate if they wanted to talk things through. They declined. Instead, they sat together on the front steps of the church, the place where they were supposed to have posed for photos as husband and wife, and talked for hours. Elaine told him everything. The full extent of her debt, the people she owed, the shame she'd carried for years. Michael listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he told her the truth too, that he was hurt, that he didn't know if he could ever trust her again, but that he didn't hate her. Because he understood what fear could make people do. They agreed to postpone any talk of marriage indefinitely. Elaine needed to deal with her debt honestly, and Michael needed time to figure out if he could forgive what had happened. They parted that day not as enemies, but not as partners either, just two people who'd almost made a terrible mistake. 6 months later, they met for coffee. Elaine had enrolled in a debt counseling program and was slowly, painfully, working her way out of the hole she'd been in. Michael had spent the time in therapy, processing his own feelings about trust and vulnerability. They talked like old friends, carefully, without promises, and when they said goodbye, they both knew this was closure. Not the ending either of them had imagined, but an ending nonetheless. Because sometimes, the kindest thing love can do is let you see the truth before it's too late. And sometimes, a forgotten phone call isn't a mistake. It's a mercy. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Michael's place? Would you have walked away the moment you heard those words? Or would you have tried to understand? And what about Elaine? Was she a villain for lying, or a victim of circumstances she couldn't control? Is desperation an excuse, or does honesty matter more than anything else? Think about the people in your own life. Think about the secrets we all carry, the things we're too afraid to admit, because we think the truth will cost us everything. How do you know when to trust, when to forgive, when to walk away? If this story made you feel something, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own choices, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories like this, real stories about real people navigating love, loss, and the complicated truth of being human. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me if you've ever been in a situation where the truth came out at the worst possible time. Because these stories, they're not just entertainment, they're mirrors. And sometimes, we need to see ourselves reflected back to understand what we're really made of. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.